Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Hi, everyone. I will speak loudly. And first, also wanted to thank Ray, Sue, and Helen, and the whole team from NewMR for pulling together this 23-hour knowledge marathon. The road to survey extinction is really a natural extension of some of the work that I've been doing in this area. John Polston, who will follow me if Ray calls us the yin and yang of gamification or the like, it's probably because we share a like-minded view for how to evolve all kinds of surveys. And given my trajectory, having worked at a big global firm and then a smaller startup, all of those firms are wonderfully successful in what they do. They just do it somewhat differently. And I think that really is the intention of what we'll accomplish today, is a recognition that we have a really growing digital divide in our industry. So perhaps the question is not whether all surveys are headed towards extinction, as some had predicted, but rather perhaps which ones and why, and what can we do to avoid that. So perhaps the first question is, what really is the problem? I don't want people to draw the conclusion that 95% of online surveys are boring, but rather that 95% of the world's online surveys today are fairly basic in their construction. And when I say basic, and I'll show you examples of that after, it is that we basically took paper surveys and put them onto computer screens, and that represents the vast, overwhelming majority of how online surveys are conducted today. Even if firms have the software to allow them to do something sexier, they don't always get chosen as question types. And we'll talk about creativity and scalability a bit later. And perhaps if we ask the question, are we getting any better at what we're doing? Well, I think where we are today is an escalation of the space race. That we first decided we would go to the moon with Flash, and after that we said, well, perhaps the moon isn't far enough and we should set our sights even higher. And now the question is, how much further into deep space can we go with game-based technologies? And one of the challenges with eye candy, and here's my metaphor for candy in survey use, is that it is in abundance. But what we have struggled with the most is how and when do we choose different types of questions for different types of needs. And to some extent, technology now it's an all-you-can-eat buffet of options. And I think as an industry, we are woefully unprepared as an industry and as a mass, not those necessarily on the webinar today, but the average researcher sitting in an office who is not a technologist, not a futurist, just a meat and potato researcher, has no idea when to use what. So as such, and thank you, Andrew, for referencing some of the work we've done, people who have followed me over these past few years know that the objective has never been to say what is better or what is worse, rather to flag some buyer bewares along the way so that we do understand some of the complexities of these issues. And I'll touch slowly on a couple of them. But if we look at the trajectory of different types of questions, perhaps visually this is the way that I could capture the different issues of basic Flash and game-based. The basic up on the top left is your standard survey layout. It encourages straight lining, at least that's what we think, because it's an ugly grid. It just looks like a Word document that somehow ended up on a computer screen. John and his team, and I know he's not talking as much about gamification today, but I certainly encourage you to read John Polston's blog. He puts more thought into this than most people do and writes eloquently about the role of gamification. Flash-based questions, as in the middle, are simply ways of trying to create a greater level of engagement with the same question. And on the bottom right, perhaps there's a misinterpretation of what gamification is, that it needs to be a very visual type of game interaction, in this case, having the skier go from the left side to the right side to choose no or yes. And the problem is that this increased level of visual interaction is that we have somehow ended up now in a digital divide where the battleground is being drawn between the old school, and we've heard already today of old MR versus new MR, or perhaps the dinosaurs versus the digital warriors. And the dinosaurs are seen as big and slow, and sure, they're strong, but not so nimble. And these new digital warriors they're nimble, they're cool, they're creative, they're bringing all kinds of new excitement to the research process. And I think what has happened over these past few years is that we have had perhaps a greater advance in some of the usability aspects of changes in the way that we interact with consumers online, not as much perhaps at understanding the implications from a data consistency point of view. So it's great to know that a mobile survey will work on multiple devices, or that it will automatically recognize whether you're using one type of smartphone or another. And I think we have made some great advances in that, certainly from a technology point of view. But from a data consistency point of view, I would argue that we're still not catching up yet with the implications of how different interfaces can create data chaos. This was from John and I's most recently presented study called How Far is Too Far, where the same question asked in 5 different ways, using basic standard text to Flash to all the way down to a game-based one with logos, etc., can produce a 40% variance in the data. And as a storyteller, when I go into my clients, I would have an issue changing a question if I knew that it was going to produce a wildly different set of results. And I think what that has led me to do is to somehow look at this from a different lens. Perhaps we're looking at the evolution in technology in the wrong way. Because if we take a purpose-driven approach to innovation, we look at it from saying, maybe my issue is that I have a certain type of question and it's producing a less than desirable research implication. Take straight lining, for example. Then we know that simply enhancing the way we ask the question with greater use of Flash or game, and I'll talk about different type of game mechanics, that you can reduce significantly by 1/3 or by half the amount of straight lining in a particular survey. And I want to highlight that it's not just about the visuals itself. And when John and I had done the most recent survey, we also worked with, which is important to highlight, that game-based can also be changes in wording. That in this case, the only difference really in the mechanics visually between the second and the third, that's the middle of your screen and the bottom right, in the way we ask this question, is that the one that had a wording change encouraged the respondent to bet on their answer. If they were really sure about who this politician was, they would bet $20. If they were somewhat sure, they would bet $10. But the implication is that as we went from a basic to a Flash to a game-based approach, we were able to eradicate any straight lining in this question. And I think what people need to take away is that gamification in its construction is not entirely a visual exercise. It's also rethinking the way we ask questions. Some of those questions that have been asked the same way for the last 10 or 15 years. And we'll touch on that in a moment because it does touch on part of the issues around creativity. Now, what did we learn in this most recent study? Well, it confirmed that once you go from any form of basic to a Flash or game-based, you do increase respondent enjoyment, and that Flash questionnaires, as I had learned in the first study, Sexy Questions, Dangerous Results, will increase the length of a questionnaire by 20%. That 20% level is consistent with the first study we had done. And game-based, likely because people are having fun and they're thinking more, significantly lengthens the questionnaire. But it doesn't have an impact on their enjoyment. So even though it takes them a lot longer when you time the survey, it doesn't have an impact, a negative impact on their enjoyment. In fact, it's the same level as Flash. So we certainly do appreciate that you need to balance multiple purposes and factors here. Certainly if one were running a long survey already, you can't make it 20, 30, 40% longer. And I guess if you then sit back and say, well, what are the barriers, if any, to some form of evolution? If we recognize that asking questions the old way is not necessarily the right way for the future, what are the barriers that are standing in our way? Well, one of them, as we recognize, is that there are a lot of big ships in the market research ocean. This is the Emma Maersk, and probably the first thing you would notice about it is that, yes, it is a big ship. But after you notice it's a big ship, the other thing that we notice about it is that all the containers are the same size. And that's because for a big ship to be profitable, you can't spend a lot of time thinking about how to load it. You make money by getting this thing loaded and unloaded as quickly as possible. Could you imagine if the 4 crane operators that have to load the 15,000 containers all of a sudden had to think about the matrix of putting together a cargo ship of this size without some form of almost automation to it? And therefore, the big ship, if you want to represent the big market research companies, they can operate with global efficiency and scalability because they don't put a lot of creativity and thinking into this aspect of the process, this aspect being survey design. It's about efficiency, getting it out the door. If a survey takes 1.5 hours to program, then thinking about it doesn't fit with the efficiency model. And I think the other important thing to mention is one of consistency that we saw earlier, that if you run tracking programs, as I do and many do, then you know that any form of a change to the interface and visual design of a survey is going to have an impact on the results. Now, John disagrees about showing it going down. It could go up, and that's part of the challenge, that we have these scales, and we don't even have industry consensus to go from a radio button with no visual cue. Should the anchor be on the left? Should it be on the middle? Should it be on the right? You know, if you answer a question from left to right, then the anchoring matters. Should it be off scale? And right now there are literally dozens of different software packages, all of whom have different visual cues of where that should be. And I thought Leonard Murphy, when he summed up the ESOMAR conference, had really succinctly summarized my point of view on this better than I could myself by saying that it really is about the user interface needing science and creativity, and that's a hard thing to operationalize. And perhaps that is the heart of the issue, and certainly captures for me this whole tricky issue of balancing creativity and scalability. It is very difficult for a big firm to try to invest time into an aspect of the process that doesn't give them an ROI. It's about scalability and norms. And these are things that are part of making a big ship run well. And that perhaps contributes to now why we see this increasing digital divide. My belief, though, is that there is an opportunity for all firms to make their surveys better. And I guess it kind of brings back the question of, are basic surveys headed towards extinction, and is that inevitable? I think the one thing I'm hoping we can accomplish is that, one, all surveys are good, but we are faced with the challenge of keeping people's attention. We're faced with the practical reality that the technology exists to make surveys better. Perhaps what we need to do is make the inevitable something avoidable, and that is by making sure that online surveys today in their basic form don't follow the same death spiral that telephone surveys have done in terms of their response rates and cooperation rates. That we can change today the words in a survey and have an impact on it even if you don't have access to flash or game-based technologies. So I think the hope I have is that all surveys, regardless of whether they're basic, flash, or game, will take to heart the goal that we have a collective consciousness to protect our industry, and that hopefully we can help those that need to scale find a way to scale creatively. And those of whom are on the cutting edge of technology will continue to push our boundaries, and hopefully we can have those best practices keep up with all the great technology that's giving us this base.